Picture a barefoot shepherd on a wind-blown Kildare hillside. It's 1640. William Reed, he's minding 300 sheep for £2 a year, plus meals. That shepherd's great-grandson will one day sign a 9,000-year lease on a Dublin brewery. That brewery is Guinness. How does a barefoot shepherd's bloodline end up owning one of the most recognizable brands on earth? That's the story. The book for today's episode is called Arthur's Round, and it was written by Patrick Guinness, who is Arthur's 5 times great grandson. He spent years cutting through the myths to find the real story. And the real story is better than the legend. I got curious about Guinness after watching the Netflix series, The House of Guinness, which is mostly fictionalized and it takes place like 100 years after Arthur. So I went looking for the real story and I found this book. Arthur Guinness didn't come from nowhere. At birth, he was already standing on the shoulders of 3 generations of his ancestors. Each generation made small moves upward in society. Shepherd to tenant farmer to tradesman, and tradesman to brewer. If you want to pick up a copy of the book, there's a link in the show notes. That is an Amazon affiliate link, and I donate all commissions to children's literacy, which, as you'll see today, literacy changed Arthur's entire family. For Arthur, everything starts with his great-grandfather, William Reed, out there on that wind-blown hillside. He was listed in 1640 as a shepherd minding some 300 sheep for a New English landlord, Sir Philip Percival, for the modest annual pay of diet and £2. It seems that Reed was at the bottom of the heap. But things are about to change for him, because William makes a big leap in the 1640s. He sees an opening when the Irish Civil War was raging, and this resulted in major damage to the land, with most of the people abandoning their farms. The long upheaval, followed by the Cornwallian raids, would have created an opening after 1650 for countrymen with local knowledge such as William Reed the shepherd. The land had to be farmed by someone, anyone, at any rent or none, or it would have reverted back to wilderness. Shepherd to tenant farmer complete. William didn't know this, but he just changed his family's history forever. Now, for Arthur's grandparents, they both took bold steps in similar ways. His grandfather on his father's side was Owen Guinness, and he was the first known direct descendant on that side of the family. And he was also on record as being a tenant farmer. He was working the land trying to survive day in and day out. But he had one advantage in that he was closer to Dublin. This put him and his children in close contact to city life, and this has a big impact for them because they see how other folks live. They get to talk to people that are beyond their farm, and little by little their world starts to get bigger. Plus, they also had access to schools, and this was a big luxury at the time. Owen sent all of his children to school. Arthur's father, Richard, as a youth, he learns the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. This was really rare. These actions taken by Owen are the building blocks for the family's long-term foundation. From the book, we can get a bird's eye view of their world. The farm's dairy produce was sold in the city streets just a couple of miles away, and the boys had a literature education of some sort. They had seen from childhood how the world went around, and they became small cogs in the machinery of commerce. Something else that helped Owen is that he was on record as being a Protestant. Either he or his father had converted from being Catholic. In the 1690s, wealthy Protestants had enacted what were called penal laws. In the minds of practical men, the worst effect of the penal laws was to remove clever, useful Catholics from public life and most professions. This makes it really hard for Catholics to hold power, land, wealth, or to vote. Being Protestant opened the doors for Owen in a rigged system that was against the Catholics. This same tool is also used by Arthur's maternal side of the family. His grandfather on this side, who was also known by the name William Reed, actually would reach voting status on the Kildare electoral rolls in 1715. This was a major milestone for him and the entire family as he was the first to do so. William, he was also a farmer, but he throws down a strong social turning point right here to break out of farming. In 1690, Arthur's farmer grandfather, William Reed, had bought a license to sell ale in order to give himself some extra income, the first written proof of any link to beer in the family. William would not have sold someone else's ale, but would have brewed it himself, as many households did, and it was safer to drink than water. Living near the main Dublin Cork road, it's likely that he sold his beer off of a stall to passing traffic, most of which was on foot. I imagine William dropping a massive boulder in the lake. That ripple effect is going to have big benefits down the road for the entire family. The first person to be impacted by the silent ripple is going to be his daughter, Elizabeth. At that time, Elizabeth Reed's understanding of her father's skill at brewing ale may have seemed unimportant. However, one day Elizabeth is going to marry Richard Guinness. As a wise woman, she brings this valuable knowledge into their marriage. As a young girl, she had learned from her father how to brew, and this knowledge didn't die with William. After Elizabeth and Richard were married, their first home is going to be in a working malthouse that was located in Selbridge. Arthur would be born in that working malthouse. His first breaths were filled with the smell of malt. Before he could even walk, he was inhaling the raw materials of his future. This seeps into his veins and his conscious being. Later in life, he chooses to become a brewer over a lawyer. One day, that smell is going to draw him back to where it all began. Inside the home, it's really common for families to make their own brew at this time. Probably Elizabeth brewed ale in the kitchen for her family, having learned the skill from her father. It goes straight back to William Reed's 1690 license. No guesswork. I think he would have been damn proud. Young Arthur is immersed in the brewing environment. He's catching everything around him. This is the same thing that we saw with Estee Lauder on the last episode. She watched her mother constantly brushing her hair and making herself beautiful every single day. Arthur watched his mother brew ale in the kitchen. More is caught than taught. Fred Rogers, same deal. We talked about him on episode 10. He constantly saw his mother in action helping others. He takes this deep love of helping children. He follows his passion for his entire life and educates millions of children all over the world through his television show, Mr. Rogers' Neighborhood. I think the author is right. Arthur's mother was the bridge. That know-how of brewing got into him at a young age. Day after day, it just stacks up. The storehouse, it holds the secrets in reserve for a future date. A bit earlier, we talked about Richard, Arthur's dad, how he had attended school. He learned to read and he learned to write, and this was essential for moving up. Because his other option of staying illiterate, it has dire impacts. Illiteracy and not speaking good English limited many to manual work, with its discomforts, low pay, and insecurities. For Arthur's forebears, embracing change was essential. Richard Guinness, he becomes a strong reader, and he writes with a clean, steady hand. I picture this skill opening the big doors of the castles. He was building his own future, skills that lift the entire family from tenant farmers to tradesmen. Being poor, the third son of a tenant farmer, Richard grasped the opportunity to be Dr. Price's agent and to fly under his master's wing, and such a position primarily required literacy. Dr. Price, who was he? Well, he was the Protestant dean of Kildare at the time, and he was a really prominent figure. This position with Dr. Price for Richard is his first real step into business. You can feel the family dynamics changing as you're reading the book. Richard's main function was as an accountant, buying and selling agent, and overseer for Dr. Price, who, as the high-flying clergyman could not be seen haggling and trading in the streets and markets for household items. Shortly after Richard starts working for Dr. Price, he's going to marry his wife, Elizabeth. This was in the early 1720s, I believe it said. Then in 1725, Arthur, he's going to be born in Selbridge. The little town of Selbridge, it's not that far from Dublin, so there's a really wide range of characters that are floating around, both rich and poor. As we mentioned, Arthur, he was growing up in that malthouse, which was also adjacent to Richard's employer, Dr. Price. Another thing that took place here is that when Arthur was young, Dr. Price, whose first name was also Arthur, is going to become his godfather, and that's where Arthur Guinness got his first name from, was from his godfather, Dr. Price, or Dr. Arthur Price. And those little details, it's going to come back and help him in the future. As a young boy, he starts off in the brewing world. He has malt in his veins, he's got the smell in his nose, and he has a mother that's brewing at home. And in addition, he's so close to the men that are working day in and day out to malt barley in that malt house, we can almost feel that something special is going to happen for Arthur in his near future. Then if we step outside that malt house and we look at the town itself, Arthur, he's in a really unique position because he can see people from all walks of life, from the very poor to the working men, all the way to the top of the social chain, and we can really get a feel of this from the book. This sleepy place was quickly becoming a commuter town for the rich and very rich. 14 miles west of Dublin, in a lovely wooded Liffey-side setting. Arthur's birthplace was also a place between places, near to Dublin but in the country. Both were places in between the old and the new, having rich and poor, traders and farmers, newcomers and long-established families. In a social sense, his parents' families were also between a harsh past and living in the hope of a better future. If we zoom to street level where a young Arthur lives, just imagine the following. At the other end of Main Street, the Conleys, the richest commoners in Ireland, were building a vast, beautiful, winged Palladium mansion on their estate at Castletown, the first of its kind in Ireland. From Castletown, where Main Street started, it would extend all the way through town and it continued into Dublin. In the book, there's a map, and if you look at the map, you can see dozens of little houses and buildings all along that Main Street. It's really easy to imagine people from all walks of life conducting business as both buyers and sellers here. Richard and the youthful Arthur would have therefore seen the wealthy traffic of every description, up to the Viceroy himself, passing up the main street of Selbridge between Castletown and Dublin. Right here, Arthur, he's taking everything in, and I believe that he's developing that feeling that it was possible to be wealthy one day, or at least make something of himself out of nothing. It must have seemed to the young boy that such wealth and confidence and its underlying system would last forever. It was certainly a world away from the experiences of most Irish people at the time. Reading the book, we see this really long scope of history, how his great-grandparents, grandparents, and parents have all worked really hard. This was a gift to the next generation and go even further. Arthur's current world that he knows, it was actually set in motion perhaps as much as 100 years before. For you and I, we are transported into this young man who probably is not even 100% aware of his past at this point. We get to experience what it was like for him, witnessing that deep drive that's starting to grow inside of him. I looked up to Michael Jordan. He was my hero. I never missed a game on the radio, or if I was really lucky, I could catch it on the television. For Arthur, his modern-day Michael Jordan were the Conleys, and all he had to do was look down Main Street towards that beautiful new mansion in Castletown. This proximity to the Conleys to the start of the Guinness story has been ignored up till now, being considered much too grand and too far up the social scale for comparison. And so they were, at the time, but they must have at least been an inspiration, proof that one could become rich and powerful, whatever one's origins, and yet be provident and well thought of at large. Picture young Arthur on Main Street right here. He doesn't need a book to tell him what success looks like. He can literally see it down the road in Castletown. It's the mansion with the big gates. And the wild part, that house that's sitting there like a sign saying, someone made it here from nothing. You can do the same. One of my personal heroes, Fred Rogers, used to ask his audience when he was speaking, who are those that have helped you become who you are today? I love that because Arthur got an answer before he even knows the question. Arthur grows up seeing both worlds, the fine coats and the worn boots. He learned early that you need to look a man in the eye no matter what his rank was in society. This serves him well at all stages of life. Like his father, he would become highly literate, and he takes his handwriting very seriously by focusing on developing a unique copperplate script style of writing. In fact, his signature can still be seen today on the Guinness product. The actual signature was taken from a lease document that he had signed in 1759. Arthur was growing up fast, and at the same time, his father was also moving up with his employer, Dr. Price, who was working hard in his career. By the time Arthur was in his teens, and very luckily for Richard, the ambitious Dr. Price had been advanced from the Dean of Kildare to Bishop of Carlingford, 1724, of Ferns, 1730, of Meath, 1734, and finally was appointed Archbishop of Cashel in 1744. The Vice-Chancellorship of Trinity College of Dublin completed his honors in 1747. In the nature of things, Richard's earnings, which were based on Price's spending, must have increased considerably, and he presumably had some resources to fall back on by now if things went wrong. I really admire Richard a lot because he didn't flash his wealth and he was a highly reserved man. He was also a saver. In fact, he valued this and it was one of his priorities. The family's launch into the world in the 1750s establishes Richard Guinness as a saver, a planner, and an investor who moved his offspring cleverly out of their motherless nest. He was their paterfamilias, that's male head of household, in much more than the biological sense. What Richard is going to do is he's going to save about 20 or 30 pounds a year over his 30 years of working, and that gave him perhaps 600 to maybe 1,000 pounds of savings. That was quite a large sum at the time, and soon it would see Richard making new investments. He believed in his children, and he would invest heavily in them. As Arthur finishes his schooling here, we see literacy in action yet again, helping to push the family upstream, as he would be employed by his godfather, Dr. Price. Literacy and connections are everything. Back within doors, Arthur was a clever and trusted youth, as Dr. Price also employed him as a registrar in his late teens, a sort of secretary copyist. Arthur is now the second-generation tradesman in the family, and he begins to learn the business side of his craft. He was already trusted and clever enough to become Richard's assistant and understudy. The various leases, contracts, and accounts may have made tedious reading, but he had Richard looking over his shoulder and explaining the text, the amounts, and the realities on the ground. If we think back to Estee Lauder's path in life, she told us that the real learning in business comes from finding a style and a voice that's your own, based upon your own successes or your failures. The schools and the books make it all seem so cut and dry. If you do this, you get this. Well, that's wrong. It's a delicate business is, and I never met anyone who learned her business from a book or a school, just as I never met a mother who raised a wonderful child from a book. Each business person must find a style, that voice that grows clearer and louder with each success and failure. Two deeply driven business founders, separated by more than 200 years, who took similar learning paths in business, working, learning, failing, learning more, succeeding, and crafting their styles. As Arthur was getting started in business, a great tragedy takes place in the fact that his mother would die at the age of only 44 years old. It doesn't say why in the book, but the author suggests that between 1739 and 1741, that famine had brought on waves of disease. And since they lived near an urban area, that disease probably spread faster and farther, and that's probably what ended up costing Elizabeth her life. After her death, the family would have her transported to their family ancestral burial grounds that was located at Auchterard. Here on this hillside is where the family all started, and upon death, they return. Didn't matter how far they went in life, they're always pulled back. But a love of the place must have been strengthened in the impressive young Arthur, listening again, no doubt, to the long forgotten local lore, and the sense of family belonging must now have been reinforced by their loss, as he and most of the family were to be buried there beside Elizabeth decades later. This side of eternity, he knew it is where he belonged. For Arthur, he's going to keep working for Dr. Price for 8 more years, learning and perfecting his craft always. 1752, Dr. Price dies, and he's going to leave Arthur 100 pounds as an inheritance. He also left Richard 100 pounds as an inheritance. That same year, his father Richard would remarry to a woman who also had the name Elizabeth. So like his mother, this Elizabeth, she knew a few things about brewing. You see, she was running this place called the White Hart Inn in Selbridge, and it also had a brewery inside of it. So what does Arthur do? He takes his new business skills and he gains a job as a brewer's apprentice. It's certain that his past brewing knowledge from his mother, along with his steady work record with Dr. Price, obviously made him a prime candidate for that position, and he uses those as inputs to quietly learn and perfect his craft. There are many variables in the brewing process: water, grain, malt, hops, and yeast. They could all be brewed together well or badly, and the aim was always to create a consistently good product. At some point, he mastered this. Another thing that matters here were the customers that he would service. This teaches him a lot. Many familiar local faces would have appeared in front of and behind the bar, along with all sorts of agents and merchants on their way to the Conleys and the neighboring gentry. If we reflect back to his youth, here he is directly brewing for all sorts of agents and merchants. He has to be thinking that possibly even he's crafting brew for the Conleys themselves. Serving his heroes and those that he looks up to in life gives Arthur that deep fuel to keep driving forward. He was always getting better at his craft, perfecting it daily. And picture this, he's focusing on something invisible but essential. Arthur's yeast must have been a Kildare strain, very likely from the White Hart Inn, as he knew its capacity. It moved with him to Leixlip and then to Dublin, and his descendants moved its myriad descendant cells abroad to Guinness breweries worldwide over the subsequent 2 centuries, to countries as far as Malaysia, Trinidad, and Nigeria, where it is still used today. In a process with many variables, not least in temperature, knowing how your yeast would react and how quickly it would turn sugars from the malted barley and hops mixture, known as wort, into alcohol was essential in those days, when beer was still handmade and much sniffed over. That is what makes it probable that he brought the strain he knew best to Dublin. Then we can learn about the time-tested durability aspect of the yeast. In an industrial era of the 19th century, many brewing yeast could not withstand the higher temperatures and pressures of large-scale brewing. But, by a lucky chance, Arthur's strain held up well and has been described to me by a yeast geneticist as uniquely hardy. It's really inspiring how Arthur dives in deep to understand this craft, and he identified this hardy yeast strain, the bedrock of his success, allowing for the development of highly consistent beer. and it's been passed along to future generations for over 270 years now. This is just one of Arthur's many gifts to elevate the status of his family. Fred Rogers said, "What is essential is invisible to the eye." For Arthur, the invisible ingredient was yeast. They called it God is good, and it's still brewing Guinness 270 years later. So after a 3-year apprenticeship, Arthur decides to take his invisible yeast strain and start his own brewery in Leixlip. It's the year 1755. He's 30 years old. Now, there are a lot of myths out there that Arthur, he had started with that 100-pound inheritance from Dr. Price. That is not quite accurate. He needed more than that. And the author, Patrick, he does a really good job outlining in detail why that is so. In a few moments ago, we had spoke about his father, Richard, who had valued savings. It was well documented that Richard had helped his son Samuel to enroll in school to become a gold beater and also helped him set up his own business as a gold beater. Then later on, Richard, he's going to help his third son, Benjamin, to become a grocer in Dublin with his own store. The evidence is solid. Richard, he would have helped Arthur push upstream to get that first brewery going in Leixlip. Just to start, it's believed that it took about 400 pounds in 1755. Not long after starting the new brewery, Arthur, he's going to marry his wife Olivia, and it says that she had a dowry of about 1,000 pounds, which was quite big at the time, and it also shows us that Arthur, he was marrying up in society, and this would really help him longer term as he continues to grow his business. Sadly for the couple, infant mortality was brutal, and it was common. Out of their 21 children, only 10 are going to survive to adulthood. I was really shocked by that, and I imagine it had to take a very hard toll on Arthur and his wife Olivia. But Arthur always continues to move forward. He's going to spend 5 years brewing in Leixlip, and like his boyhood home in Selbridge, Leixlip, it's just 5 miles away, so he's really familiar with the surroundings, and it has a lot of similar qualities. While Leixlip was a small market in itself, it was also on the main Dublin-Galway road, and had acquired a number of small country houses, of the type known as gentlemen's boxes, and was, like Selbridge, a popular place for the wealthy to live, being 11 miles west of Dublin. Such moneyed households might need and appreciate an ale of a consistent quality. In addition, the town also would attract a lot of weekend tourists from Dublin, as there was this popular waterfall where salmon would leap, and there was also a nice park. All of this provides Arthur with a consistent flow of day trippers from the city that, of course, needed to satisfy their thirst with one of Arthur's ales. They didn't need to bring them from home. They could simply stop in the brewery and check out his ales. It wasn't that uncommon for households and inns to brew their own beer, so there really was a lot of competition. And the fact that Arthur remained in business really tells me that he was committed to his craft. Remember that he's highly literate. He already has a good business foundation right here with an understanding of accounting and the law. And at this stage of life, he could have made more money and had less risk working in a professional capacity as a lawyer or an accountant. Brewing, it was looked at as a manual trade. This tells me even further that he loved what he was doing. He had a deeply driven nature towards this craft that he's perfecting. He's taking this business knowledge that he had learned from Dr. Price and his father, and he's combining it together with this manual trade, and he uses this drive to grow his business and his brand. Things are starting to roll for Arthur. Then, in addition, while he's in Leixlip, Arthur would diversify his business by picking up leases on land. Then he would build little houses that he would sublet out. Along with this, he also helps to build out Main Street of Leixlip. Even after he leaves town for Dublin, he continues with the project. The conclusion must be that after 3 decades or so, he built most of the central Main Street at a cost of several £1,000s, which today still mainly consist of 2-story houses similar to those in Selbridge. For Arthur, he really understood that he needed to build social connections. This carries a lot of weight. In 1758, Arthur joined the new Kildare Dining Club, the membership, politics, and ethos of which also have been ignored by my family historians. That was to have a far reaching impact on his life. If we expand this club, they took an anti dueling stance and they promoted brotherly love between their members. Most of them were businessmen or politicians. They would also go out and raise money for charitable causes. And it was a sad fact at the time. It was quite common for men that held grudges with one another to have duels with guns. A lot of family men would die this way. Arthur, he didn't believe in this type of violence and he felt that disputes could be resolved peacefully. Plus, this club, it wasn't affiliated with any particular religious denomination. This helps them attract a broad group of businessmen all across the region, and it allows Arthur to strengthen his social connections even further. Now, something interesting in history is happening shortly after Arthur opened his first brewery. The 7 Years' War would start in 1756. This caused an economic upset in Ireland and it led to the collapse of several banks in Dublin, and it severely depressed the land prices at the same time. Arthur's going to make the same move his grandfather did 100 years previous. When the economy was depressed from the Civil War, and he went from a shepherd to a tenant farmer, moving up in the world. Still brewing at Leixlip and negotiating his lease for the distressed brewery at St. James Gate in 1759, we can see from its terms that it had potential. But despite its modest fixed annual rent of £45 and a tiny premium of 1 peppercorn for a term of 9,000 years, Arthur was almost starting from scratch. I had to read that twice. A 9,000-year lease? How in the world do you get to 9,000 years in your lease term? I did a little bit of extra researching, and it seems that this was quite common at the time. If you wanted to ensure a long-term placement, you would have signed like a 999-year lease or a 10,000-year lease or something along those lines. So while it seems quite crazy for us today, that was more common then to ensure that your future generations could use that land. I also discovered that it looks like the Guinness family, they ended up purchasing that actual land that had been leased several generations later as they continued to expand that brewery. And I think that was obviously very smart of them to do that. For Arthur at the time of the lease, the site, it really needs a lot of work. It had been vacant for 9 years and almost everything needed repaired or replaced. St. James Gate at the start consisted of 4 acres. It had a dwelling house, a brew house, 2 malt houses, outhouses and stables for 12 horses. It could hold 200 cartloads of hay, and then it had a garden with a summer house and a pond, as was described in the book. The lease also gave him lifetime access to water from the city basin, or so Arthur thought. 5 years in, city officials show up and say that he owes them for water. This would kick off a decades-long battle over water access. Listen to what would happen when they tried to cut off his water supply about 10 years into the dispute. Mr. Guinness was on the scene. He violently rushed upon them, wrenched a pickaxe from one, and declaring with much improper language that they should not proceed, he stood with the pickaxe in their way and prevented them from working. Over my dead effing body are you cutting off my water supply? The dispute is going to drag on for 24 years. Arthur's going to use a lot of his social connections to help drag things out. His focus, access to good, clean water for free. Arthur needed to save every penny in cost, as we're soon going to see. Meanwhile, back at St. James Gate, a lot of repairs were needed. One can imagine the inspection visit by Richard, with the old man scratching his head and wondering what the final cost would be. and whether all estimates had been double checked. They took the plunge, which indicates that Richard approved of Arthur's management record in leak slip. Richard continues to invest in his children's future. From my view, he's getting a 2-for-1 in this next bold move. Richard must have been involved, as the leak slip brewery and investment properties were not sold to pay for the Dublin brewery, as it was often assumed. The investment properties remained Arthur's, and Richard Jr. took on the leak slip brewery and its house. Thus, a second Guinness brewing business was established, distant enough to avoid mutual competition. Wise move. Arthur, he's in a really good spot, and this tells me that he was generating revenue from that leak slip brewery. Plus, they have another advantage as they can showcase their ale to potential new clients while they worked on repairing the brewery. It is feasible that on his startup in 1760, Arthur carted barrels of his ale the 11 miles from leak slip to Dublin and gave free samples to inns and taverns to get orders. His cousins living in the city were there to make introductions to innkeepers and publicans. This pre-marketing process could have started in 1758 or 1759, and it would seem careless for him not to have done this. We mentioned earlier Arthur's twin in business, Estee Lauder, who 200 years later would pioneer the free sample with or without sale, because she had full faith in her products and 100% knew that once a woman tried them, they must have them. Imagine you open your brewery to a long list of orders from clients that wanted your ale. Those strong family and social connections that he's been building for the past 20 years at this point, they pay off early. Plus, Arthur's reputation as a brewer who always created the same beer over and over grows his loyal base of customers. It took time and it took persistence, but he focused on this. And after 7 years in business, out of the 40 brewers in Dublin, he ranked in the middle. We can see from tax records that brewers at the top were paying something like £4,000 a year in taxes, and he was paying somewhere around $1,500. For Arthur, he faces 3 types of competition. The obvious were the other brewers. Next was this growing popularity of Irish whiskey, which many people just brewed at home. Then the third were pressures from beer that was being imported from England. From the records, we can see that English imports were around 30,000 barrels a year when Arthur first started his brewery in Dublin. And then over a period of time, it would rise to about 125,000 barrels a year. So year over year, the pressure is just slowly building up. The fight was always endless for Arthur. The British, they also had a major tax advantage, and they leveraged the snot out of it. To import British porter, the tax broke down to 2 pennies a barrel. Now, if you're an Irish brewer, they had to pay 5 shillings and 6 pennies, or 66 pennies per barrel. That's a huge hit. The British brewers, they could export their beer to Ireland and sell it cheaper than they could in England, which is just crazy. And it reminds me exactly of John D. Rockefeller, who could sell his kerosene cheaper than what others could produce it for. Imagine that he was selling a gallon of kerosene for 25 cents, and you're the owner of a competing refinery, and you had a cost of 35 cents. There is no way you could ever compete with them. The Irish brewers, they're stuck with this unfair tax system, and this just adds to their cost and their frustrations, and many are going to fail. Only the best survived. For Arthur, he's going to continue to make appeal after appeal after appeal to have the taxes reduced or repealed, often with a lot of failure. At one point, he even threatened to move his brewery operations, stating that he had already been to Wales in search of a brewery site and that he would just go settle there and then export his brew back to Ireland. What a dramatic jump that would have been. I mean, Imagine moving your brewery to an entire different country, producing beer over there, and then exporting it all back to Ireland so that you could sell it cheaper than just staying on your home turf in Ireland. That is simply nuts. That was a huge impact. The tax, it was always a problem for them. Then, to compound things even more, another major shift happens with brewing imports in the mid 1770s because the British, they start flooding porter into Ireland, and it quickly becomes the drink of choice in Dublin. Now keep in mind, Arthur and his peers, they're all still brewing ale, which just adds a lot of pressure because now they can't even raise the price of their ale to help cover increasing cost. Because if they did, many pub owners are simply just going to switch over to selling 100% porter. If you put yourself in the pub owner's shoes here just for a second, porter has a few major advantages. The first is that it was the new drink in the market. It's thicker, it's stronger, and it's a more satisfying brew. Second is that the profit margins were higher. And then third, porter has a much longer shelf life. So as a pub owner, you're not worried about your inventory going bad. I think the choice is really easy. If you're that pub owner, of course, you're going to sell porter. However, it's not going to take long for those Dublin brewers to start producing their own porters. And Arthur, he really needs to make a decision right here. Competition from the English porters was bad enough, and now its rivals in Dublin were starting to brew it as well. He had to keep up or fall behind, and those that fell behind could go bankrupt. Really, he had no choice. A lot of myths say that Arthur was the pioneer of porter, and that's not quite true. As outlined so well in the book, there was no magical formula that just fell out of the sky. There was no secret documents that Arthur discovered. As a sharp-eyed young businessman, he learned to brew porter by copying what others were doing. And then he perfected that process and he made it his own. Arthur understood that you don't have to invent, but you do have to execute better, helping the family to push upstream even further. Arthur's lasting contribution to Dublin and to his family was to copy porter well and in volume. I just want to read that one more time. This is one of the most key sentences of the whole book. Arthur's lasting contribution to Dublin and to his family was to copy porter well and in volume. 1778, Arthur sells his first porter in Dublin, 2 years after his counterparts in Ireland had started brewing the crowd favorite. As a quick win, he's also going to find himself in a position 1 year later being awarded a contract to supply Dublin Castle with beer, and this was a major victory for Arthur. Reflecting back to his youth, he had looked up to those who resided in those big castles. Now here he is, he's supplying them with porter. This was a huge boost for the brewery. The author here, he couldn't find any records on how Arthur had landed this particular contract. And I have to believe, quite simply, that it was word of mouth. Arthur, he had developed a porter that was uniquely its own, based on 30 years of brewing knowledge. Plus, we know that he was focused on consistency and quality. The most powerful form of advertising there is helped him land that contract. I know it's simple thinking, but it's the simple concepts that are also the most deep. Arthur, he doesn't stop there. He continues perfecting his craft even as he's aging in years. Age 65 in 1790, Arthur might have considered it time to think about retirement and handing things over. But his last decade became his busiest in all areas: business, politics, and his family. Arthur is deeply driven and he loves business. In 1794, another major breakthrough is going to take place when the English Gentleman's Magazine published what the book calls the first public representation of Arthur's Porter beer. And there's this illustration featuring a man that's enjoying a drink in front of a clearly labeled barrel that says Guinness Porter. This is a magazine that was widely read by the educated, and by affluent subscribers all throughout Britain and its empire. There's a copy of the illustration in the book. It's quite interesting. It shows a gentleman that looks like he's been working all day, but has some sort of rank in society. And he's enjoying a really hearty meal after a long day at work. This is how I picture it. And then he's picking up this tasty mug of Guinness to wash everything down. The caption reads, "Health, peace, and prosperity." Amazing. London was the birthplace of porter. And here we see an Irish brewer who copied their product. He perfected it in his own style and he made it his own. Those in London are certainly taking note. This is the first known publication of Arthur's brand anywhere. And it reminds me of Sam Walton and what he did. He would go to his competitors' stores, fill up his yellow legal pad, and then run back to his own store and implement it. Sam, he copied well, but he executed better. And as a result, we have Walmart today. This is a simple concept on the surface, but if you take it to extreme depths and make what you study your own, it's going to have big results for you. After battling for more than 20 years, and 1 year after that magazine article, the tax on beer is finally going to be killed. This was a big win for Arthur. The brewing gods are smiling down on him. It's interesting to note that from the records, we can see British imports start to drop, and over the next 5 or 6 years, they would be cut in half. And then to add to this, the British tax on malt would increase for English brewers, and this adds a lot of extra pressure to their cost. This opens the door for Dublin to start increasing their exports to London. In order to help with these efforts, Arthur, he needs to expand. The way was now clear for Arthur to plan to rebuild his brewery so as to expand production, and this overhaul started in 1797. This is why Arthur is so deeply driven. After 40 years of brewing, at the age of 72, he decided to overhaul the brewery and he keeps pushing up market. Arthur reinvested over 6,000 pounds of his profits back into rebuilding his brewery between 1797 and 1799. At this point here, two of his sons, Arthur II and Benjamin, they were also helping out in the business. Like his father Richard, Arthur pours large investments into each of his children. His oldest son, Hosea, he's going to be educated in the finest schools, going on to become a doctor of divinity. For Arthur II, he's going to start working in the business in 1790. And by the time his son Benjamin starts working in the craft, it's the late 1790s. And he's going to write the following about his father during this time. "Our father was very unwell last week, but is now quite well. He generally comes to St. James Gate every day and stays here for an hour or two and sometimes rides out to the mills. This gives him good exercise, which is quite necessary. He never takes his finger off of the pulse. With the completion of the brewery expansion, Arthur and his sons make another bold move. They switch to brewing only porter. After 44 years of brewing ale, Arthur would focus only on producing porter. This decision will define the Guinness brand and the family for the next 2 generations and beyond." Several years later, in 1803, Arthur dies, leaving the brewery to his sons, Arthur II, Benjamin, and William. Like his mother, he's buried at Auchard, where it all started for the family, generations prior. This is where we'll leave the fascinating story about Arthur Guinness. For more in-depth coverage and all of the details, I would highly suggest picking up a copy of the book. It's really fascinating to have this wide overview to see how Arthur fit into the overall chain of his family's history, how he stood on the shoulders of his ancestors, took his deeply driven drive and love of brewing, and founded one of the most recognizable beers in the world. That's the real story that Netflix couldn't tell you. Thanks for listening today. I hope you were able to find some value in the episode that will help you in your business. If you did, perhaps you would leave me some feedback or possibly even follow the show. Until next time, make it a beautiful day in the neighborhood, my friend.